Security was quite incredibly tight. I'd said no, I didn't. I had no idea when the invasion was going to be. I think I was told by my CEO 2 days before the invasion. And I think we all guessed it was going to be that year, and I suppose obviously you guessed it had been in the summer sometime. But nobody knew better nearer than that until the thing. No, security, thank goodness, was very tight, because that was the third disaster that had happened in many invasions, when in most of them, I think the Germans knew exactly when we were coming, where, and exactly what time. This time they didn't, and we fought them completely over this. This is a critical thing. All through the winter of 43, we trained up in a very lonely Scottish isle in order to how we would do the COP work out of Nextcroft, which were tiny. At first thing, until you knew what was going on, it was just another appointment. You know, I'd move ships, you were appointed from one ship and another. Most of the time things would happen, some of the times it didn't. Everybody realised that something must be afoot, big. I mean, I think we all guessed, but there were no official. Nobody said it was assumed that there was going to be a big invasion. And we came down sort of mid-January where we were trained. We reckoned we were ready to operate, and there we were under the orders of the command who was doing the invasion.
You leave Portsmouth. Mm-hmm. How long do you know you're going to be at sea for?
It was going to take 2.5 days to get across.
And you're not just going across a placid sailing lake. This is the height of the war. You knew there would be dangers out there.
Well, indeed. And the point was that there were minefields. And, of course, at the end of the day, the minefields are all brilliantly swept. The day before, actually, the D-Day, but of course they weren't swept when we crossed. So we had to go across them because we had a shallow draft. We could go over the top of them on the surface, but not if we were submerged. And of course we couldn't go on the surface at daytime because we would have been seen. So we had to plan the trip. So we went over the surface of the mines during the night at the surface on our diesel. And the rest of the time then had to be by periscope.
What were conditions like on the submarine? Because it's a long time to spend in close quarters with people I'm sure you were friends with, but I'm sure you'd rather have been spending time in close quarters with someone else, perhaps in different conditions.
Well, indeed. I mean, we all knew each other very well because we had trained together, obviously, and we got on very well. Yes, we had drunk beer together and that sort of thing. Well, we took it in turns to sleep. The boat has a central sort of compartment, which in fact is both the loo and the diving compartment where they're diving, and also the main entry into the boat from the top. So you had to go through that, and ahead of that, to the bows, there was the main battery compartment. So we took it in turns to sleep there. There was one sleeping bag to all of us. So you grabbed that, and obviously it was not the most hygienic thing at the end of the operation. But we used to get about half an hour at a time and go up there. So it was, and then we just chatted away and that sort of thing. I think we were pretty serious lot. We weren't all that jokey, you know.
You arrive at the beaches, or the position of where you're monitoring from, and you look, what do you see of this, what is in the next few days going to be overrun by British and American troops? But when you get there, you're this sole or one of two submarines in enemy waters, you've come over minefields, you look up, what can you see?
Well, after we did arrive, my CEO and I, between us, we got our position dead right. I mean, it's a question of things aboard, things near the coast. I mean, clock towers and special things which we could recognise from the chart. So we fixed our position very exactly, which is exactly where we told we had to be. And then we bottomed with an anchor. We would come up in the day by periscope and look around. And yes, we did once. We had to look on the beach. We did see the Germans playing football on the beach. So we did joke a bit about they didn't know what was going to happen on the morrow.
War is a horrible, horrible thing, and it's the people stories we tend to forget. And as much as we're commemorating the British and the American losses, on the German side of things, you've just seen people, I imagine, probably your age, probably just following orders, kicking a football about on the beach, and you know what's coming, and they do not know what's coming. What emotions did that arouse in you, if any?
Perhaps it brought us up full stop, realising that something big was coming on, because, of course, by then we did know, I suppose, or the next day, when we got the message, the thing was on, that it was something really big coming. It's quite an interesting point you made. I don't think any of us, none of us realised really the vastness of this operation, because of course that's all so incredibly secret, really. Then we got the message, the second message, which said it's on tomorrow, and of course bingo, really. That was the middle of the night. because of the long day, of course, in June, very long day, we had to sit on the bottom, you see, for all that time. And during that time, we very nearly ran out of oxygen. And that would have been disastrous because, we couldn't risk surfacing in case if the operation was cancelled for another day. It is giving away the position, quite obviously. If Germans sees a military submarine off beach, they've got to assume something's happening, haven't they? Finally surfaced about 05W, I think, 5 in the morning, and put up all our complicated lights and radar beacons and things we had, and I waited for dawn, really. Not the dawn, waited for what would happen.
And as you're waiting there, it must be an incredibly vulnerable position because you've surfaced and you're ready to go, and you don't know whether if at the other end there's a technical hold-up and if the American and the British are coming, and if they're not, you're in a very vulnerable position.
Well, indeed it was, and we did feel very lonely, yes indeed, because there we were, stuck there, yes. First thing we saw, actually, was the arrival of the RAF in force. Suddenly, because it was so silent, first of all, we absolutely silent. Of course, all engines stopped. We were just anchored and sitting there. And it had gone much calmer. It had been quite rough up to that point. And then suddenly the RAF arrived, and in just terrific strength, and just went up and down the beach, the back behind us, just bombing it up and, all the time. That was noise. And then there was a big pause, actually, and we wondered what was going to happen. See, we still didn't realise, really, that nobody knew the size of the thing. And then, actually, the next thing that happened was our Navy big battleships, which, in fact, were 15 miles out at sea, were firing by radar, of course, onto the beach. And, of course, the shells went over the top of us. We could hear them whistling across. And then there was a silence. It was only then, out of the mist, then the big one really, suddenly, my gosh, there was this there's no word to describe it. You can't say incredible because, it was there. Just thousands of approaching ships, and there we were. That was the end of the story, as far as we're concerned, because our job was done. In fact, we were then ordered back alongside the control ship.
And when your job is done, what does one do after that? Is it a bottle of beer, a job well done, and what's next? Because you tell it in such a matter-of-fact way, and I think looking back over history, it's such a turning point, but for you it was just a job you trained and prepared for. What was the mood like once you surfaced and you knew your job was done and done well?
Well, immediately, of course, we were very glad because we were all ushered up to the captain's cabin, and we must have been incredibly smelly. And he said, would you all like a bath? And we all had a bath.
Let me ask you about, we mentioned this a little earlier when we were talking, psychologically, Europe has been swept aside by the German forces. Although the Russians are pushing back on their front, this was such a psychological barrier for the Allied forces to overcome, to get this landing right, and the forces had amassed, and if it had gone wrong, who knows how the war could have turned. Did you realise at that point, what a significant thing you had taken part on when you saw emerging from the mist all these troops?
Well, I don't think we did at the time. I do agree that since one reads afterwards, one does realise that it was, do or die, what would happen, as you say. I think you probably know Eisenhower had an emergency letter, didn't he, or announcement which he would have made if he'd had to withdraw. And then what would have happened? Could we have mounted another one? I don't know. And if we can speculate about what would have happened then. But as it happened, of course, it did mean that the French realised for the first time, and this is why this current D-Day is so much bigger in France than with us, because to them it really was obviously, they were convinced that once we landed we would win somehow and chuck the Germans out, and they'd had them bossing them and running their whole country, for 4 long years with the awful business of having the petards who were traitors of their own country. Pretty awful for them. Sitting
chatting with you now, I am a little in awe because of the risks you took, the part in history you played, and I think there's no doubt saying that you were a key part, one of many I'm sure you'd say, but in a crucial part of 20th century history. And yet we sit at your home and you talk very modestly about the first thing you did afterwards was have a bath. Looking back at it now, do you realise what you were part of, and what does it make you feel? I think now I do, and I think the others do. And of course I'm sad because I'm the sole survivor of those 2 ex-craft teams, actually. So I've got nobody else to talk to about it.
I don't think at the time we did. I mean, we were all young men, and we talked about the usual things that young men talk about, like girls and things, And but no, at the time we didn't. But certainly since then, and obviously now one reads and one gets more into history and so on. But one didn't at the time, no.
Heroes are generally unassuming and often multi-skilled, but few of us would expect church organist, chorister, keen allotment holder and cyclist Jim Booth to have had such a colourful wartime record. When he came back to his old haunt here at Hayling Island Sailing Club last spring, Jim told me about his mission to the Gold Beach landing site in 1944, crewing an X-craft midget submarine. Apparently, that mission went so well that on their return, the X-craft crews were promptly posted to the Far East. We were extremely fortunate to obtain this BBC footage of a D-Day piece by the late Jill Dando, which says so much about the courageous exploits of the extraordinary men of Combined Operations Pilotage Parties.
Submarines were underwater, underhand, and damned un-English. No occupation for a gentleman. Such was the view of submariners in the early part of this century. It was thought sneaky, creeping around beneath the water, out of view of conventional craft. The Jolly Roger, flown by submariners, gives us some idea, though, of the pride they had in their role and that reputation. On the evening of Friday, the 2nd of June, 1944, 2 X-craft like this one set out to uphold the very best of submarining traditions. Their job was to creep undetected to the Normandy coast, and they were then to sit on the bottom until dawn on D-Day. Their job then was to run up lights on masts to guide the Allied fleet in. George Honour was a lieutenant commanding one of the subs at the time. George, what were conditions like being underwater for so long?
Well, by the time D-Day came, we'd been submerged for nearly 4 days, and it was getting very murky, and the oxygen supply could have been running out, as we had no knowledge of how long our supply would last. We were a little bit worried, too, because when we set off on the operation, we were called Operation Gambit, and we looked this up in the local library, and we found it was the move you throw away before a big move in chess, which didn't exactly excite us.
So, Jim, what was your role in the operation?
Well, I was in an organisation called COP, Combined Operations Pilotage and Reconnaissance Party, and my team's job, embarked in the X-23, was to arrive off the Sword Beach, in fact 48 hours before, fix our position extremely accurately, which we had to do, and then produce a marker lamp which could be shone to seaward at the actual time of the invasion, so the leading craft would then see the line to come in on, and they wouldn't go farther to the east, which would have been extremely dangerous for them.
So when did you hear that D-Day itself was actually going to go ahead?
We heard by wireless transmission on Monday night, during the hours of darkness. We only surfaced for a very short time, stuck our aerial up, got the message and went down again, and waited a further 24 hours.
And what were conditions like then?
The weather was still terribly bad. Wave would break over the craft, we had to pump out all the time, and we were very surprised that the invasion was then on, but very relieved, as our oxygen may well have been running out.
Yes, what were conditions like inside for 5 men?
Well, we were all right as long as the oxygen supply kept up. Of course, it was murky, damp, and otherwise very horrible, and there was a feeling of rather like a couple of stiff gins.
It's only when you climb in one of these craft for yourself, you see how cramped conditions must have been for 5 men in here altogether. This is the control room. If they wanted to grab a couple of hours sleep, then they could go there. That's the battery room back there.
I don't remember ever feeling it was dangerous, but then that is what happens in war. I think servicemen never believe that anything can happen to them.
That's Jim Booth on the bows of X-23 on D-Day.
From flashing light, and I think it had a radio beacon of sorts on it, which we had to get all up and rig up on the upper deck. There had been a plan to put out a dinghy, but it was just too rough to do that as well, to make a transit. But we managed to make the transit by having one of the lights astern and the one on the bow. That's the other way around, that's the bow, that's the astern. So we set it all up at 5 o'clock, and then we're waiting. And then, wow, yes, wow, that was quite tight when this whole thing started.
They all just came past you?
Well, first of all, of course, the RAF arrived in force and just went up and down the top of the beach, just, wow, terrific, just pounded and pounded and pounded. We were only a quarter of a mile offshore, but it just appeared to be, we felt as if we were much nearer, spectacular, very spectacular. And then a halt. Oh, and then the battleships, had been brought up behind the invasion force. They were 20 miles away or something, but of course, they can fire for 20 miles, probably only 10 miles if I know, but quite a long way back. And they pounded the beach. These enormous shells whistled over us, and you could hear them whistling across. That was pretty spectacular. Then that stopped. Then at long last, we saw ships arriving. And thank goodness, it all went right as far as our bit was concerned, to the extent that the DD tanks passed and they didn't flood, because they'd been dropped off the right distance from the shore. Because what unfortunately happened to the Americans was because they didn't have guys to guide them in, and they didn't know how far off the shore they were. To make sure, they'd dropped them off far too far out, and they filled up with water. The very last night of all, we knew we'd have to leave, so we had dinner in the wardroom, and nobody turned a hair. And they said, "Come on, Jim, where we go?" And we just slided out and joined the boat. Of course, we motored a bit out into we were picked up by a trawler, yes, who towed us out. I was working with line, of course, all the time. That's my job, really, is to help him. Some of the time just steering. I was on the wheel a lot of the time, or taking bearings. We had to go across the minefield. That was what we were all talking very much about. That was our own minefield. So we got across the minefield, and then as soon as we got which should have been at about dawn, we went down at periscope depth, of course, then, and motored down towards the beaches. Then we'd established where we were, and then he started motoring over to our position. So then we bottomed. Of course, you know what you do, which is difficult because we had to do it in the daytime, and that was very tricky. So we didn't dare to surface to come up to periscope depth really, except we came to this first business where we could just spread. And my job was to jump out of the thing, find the hatch quickly, and drop the anchor. You see. We were then, of course, in this incredibly dangerous position for a submarine, of all things, because we were anchored and sitting on the bottom. And, if anybody had seen us, you obviously have been very defensive to see that you couldn't move, really. Instead of using a little boat, my part was all my equipment, which would have gone on the little dinghy, was on the stern of the boat of the X-craft, and the bow had the big lights and flags. So yes, we surfaced and waited, and complete silence. And this is almost, because we were all known by then. I mean, the other boat was, 30 miles away. Well, the first thing, of course, was the big bombers, who came up from one end, strafed the beaches right up and down and up and down and up and down and down, bombs all the time. And we were all saying bingo, sort of thing. And then they disappeared off, and then just absolute silence again, absolute silence. We were thinking, come on, what's happening? We still didn't really know what the hell was this all about. We knew it was a sort of invasion. What, I really didn't know much more. That was the secrecy, such she was, and good thing too, wasn't it? Secrecy. And then, of course, the next was the battleships. And they opened up from 15 miles with the 16-inch guns, and the shells came whistling over us. They whistled, they literally did. Then there was another silence, you see. We thought, well, what the hell is going on, And then of course, suddenly, and this is true, that the mist sort of cleared, because by then it was, 4 o'clock or something, 6 o'clock. And then we thought, just look at it. I mean, it was just boats, ships. I mean, that was quite incredible. We were all of us were standing on the top of the boat, of course, she was anchored. So we were just singing like that. The DD tanks came past, and we were very pleased by then to know, Line must have known by then that this is the point critical. Most of ours didn't, in fact, even drive off. They kept them right into the beach. But anyway, they passed us, and we waved, And then, an MTB came over to us and said, "Gone back to the logs," was the default control ship, HMS Logs. Well, then we had got all the equipment aboard, and we managed to put up a lovely white ensign up on the stern, because we thought, and we followed this MTB, and he led us to the large HMS Logs and went up alongside. And Line went straight aboard to report, because he was in charge of the operation, and stayed aboard. And then we were invited to, all the rest of the crew, to go aboard the Logs, which we did. And he gave us a bath. He was an admiral. He had an admiral's cabin, captain's cabin. He had a bath, and so we all had to soak.
Well, Jim, as we come to the end of the interview, what do you think are some of the qualities required of a specialist soldier or sailor, like a copist and a commando? What is it that you think makes a person effective in that role?
I think all the cop people were exciting people. They were fun. After we knew each other better, we did, let's face it, go out and drink beer and etc. together. And they were all good, sociable people. We were all sociable. I think you've got to be be able to work together, haven't you? Perhaps that's one of the things. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, because they were so mixed, weren't we? We were all such a mixed bunch. And then we went out east with all cop teams, and we went to Hamley Hill Camp in North Ceylon, as it was, and no X-craft or anything, and got back to practicing cop in old-fashioned ways, dinghies and canoes and swimming in tropics, in no suits like that, very nice. And we trained a bit, and then we went and operated for 5 months in Burma, ahead of the 14th Army, wrecking and doing marking operations down the west coast of Burma before they finally operated for Rangoon. They landed in Rangoon.
Can you tell me a little bit about those operations?
Well, those are far more exciting than D-Day operations, because the Japanese are everywhere, and you don't want to get caught by a Japanese then. We were working behind the lines all the time without any communication, and we were endlessly just sort of managing to. Some Burmese might tell us there are Japanese in there, and we either try and keep away, because we're supposed not, obviously cop were not supposed to be seen, that was the point about it. Or, at one point, we actually got caught up a charm, and very nearly in a dinghy, in a landing craft, and they managed to shell us, and they damaged us, but we got away with it, all right. And the CEO said, "Come on, we've got to deal with that one." So we thought, well, God, all right, we got to tell us as a commando, because we were commando trained, by the way, with knives, proper commando. And so we did land afterwards, because obviously we now knew where they lived, where their base was, and we sneaked up overnight and eliminated them as a bit of commando. About 10 of them. There we are.
So these operations then, Jim, they were you were no longer using the X-craft here, were you?
No.
What would you use? In
Well, we had
operation?
our own LCA landing craft. We had the LCA is the small one landing craft. We just take one small group of soldiers in there, just with the thing goes down the front, you know. And we used to just use that.
And you would use your canoes from that, would you?
No, we never had canoes.
Oh, so
we did have canoes with us, but in fact most of the time we swam. Just in swimming trunks.
How would you carry the rest of your equipment? Would you have a belt or something?
Well, you see, it was so simple then. Well, all we wanted to know was to go back to the army commander and say, "Can you land in that place? Is it okay? Is there a bit of beach? Can the soldiers go down?" So that's all we had to do. We didn't have to get anything complicated about, gradients or something like, or beach gradient, because they took our word for it, really. So,
so it wasn't as complicated, maybe, as the D-Day
very simple, yes.
work had been.
Yes.
So on these things, what would you do? Where would you run out with the landing craft from? Would you come from? Would you have a larger sort of ship to run the landing craft?
Yeah, we came back. The 14th Army, they're the Forgotten Army, the famous, were coming down the centre of Burma, of course, down the Irrawaddy, isn't it? And I think it's called the 42 College, a corps, separate one. You were coming down the beach, the coast, the west coast of Burma. And of course, the whole object was Rangoon, which was the capital, obviously. So they were all aiming to get there, incidentally, before the monsoon broke, because after that you don't have wars when there's a monsoon on. You go on a holiday. Well, you have to, so it was a rush to get onto there. So basically, the whole of that west coast was full of chongs. They're inland seas, if that's the coast. They're endless rivers, saltwater rivers, with saltwater things narrow. And so the soldiers had to come up sea and go in one of the chongs and get far enough down to get, they're trying to get south all the time. And so that was all it asked us to go down each chong and look at, that fucking use. Go down the next one, so there's a bit of a bit, they can manage there, and go back and tell them. I mean, that's what it boiled down to, really. But then also we did, because there were some secret agents in there as well, and so we were drifting on, and so we spent some time with him, helping him, because he was in a problem too. And we managed to capture 3 Japanese and took them back. And so we had a bit of a decision whether what we should do with them, because we knew what the Japanese did to them.
So Jim, tell me a little bit more about this operation with the agent and the capture of the Japanese. What actually happened?
Well, he had Burmese friends, obviously had to, and so he got some information about what was going on, where the Japanese were. So that's how we managed to go a second time, when in fact most of them run away, but there were 4 left, and I'm afraid they put their hands up, so we simply took them as prisoners. And that's when we had to decide what we're going to do with them. Well, we decided to be British and take them back. It was a bloody nuisance, because and they were obviously poor people. They expected us to kill them instantly. And they sat in the bottom LCA. We set them there. I think half the time I was told to point a bloody rifle at them. Poor buggers, they were totally shivering, because they assumed we were going to shoot them. We took them back. I don't think the army were too pleased to see them. Oh, bloody hell! What we can do with these? But they did, I'm sure, look after them properly.
So with the Japanese, because you mentioned that other incident where you eliminated them, but were the Japanese in sort of isolated groups, really, at that stage?
Yes, totally, because it's jungle. This is Burmese jungle, and you can't see 20 yards ahead. You just forge your way through. And yes, but we took our commando knives there in case. We take them to I've got mine still, of course. We had a story about that I'll tell you afterwards. And I managed to get mine back after all this time. I took them to Normandy too, because to go back to Normandy, of course, the ultimate problem could have been if it had been postponed for another and then cancelled, because there was not another window of tide and moonlight, which is all dependent on how they'd chosen it, for nearly a month, I think. So we'd had to get back or do something. Well, the craft wouldn't be able to make it. As it worked out, we had no gyro. And, I mean, there's no way you could have got it. I could hope to get some, but they'd almost certainly gone a minefield, because they wouldn't have swept the mines. So the plan then would have been, or had been definitely, we'd have had to sink the craft in deep water and swim ashore at night and be commandos with our commando knives, and found the French resistance somehow and hoped that they would hide us, you know. So that's why we took our commando knives first. So mine does say Normandy 94 put on it, because it did genuinely go, and then it also went to Burma, yeah.
And this other case with the Japanese, you mentioned briefly, obviously, that when you had to eliminate them, were they? What was that? What was the situation with this group? What were they doing?
I don't really know. I mean, they had a gun. They'd fired a gun, not a rifle, a proper gun with shells in it. You know, we were in a landing craft in this Shong, and we'd gone further up it to try and find a landing craft, a landing spot to fire. And as we'd gone up, of course, they'd found us. And we realised, bloody hell, we can't go back past that again. So we had to hurry to get down. And we saw we couldn't go out at night because we couldn't see it. We knew there were rocks, so we knew we'd have to hope to rush it at day. So we did rush it at day. We got close in one side, then made a mad rush. And luckily they missed. They followed hopelessly. So we got by the corner, round the corner. That's when we decided we ought to deal with them. Good for the CEO, because he wasn't really supposed to do that, actually. I think he didn't put in his report, actually. Technically, cops are not supposed to carry out aggressive operations.
Really interesting stuff, Jim. So, in actual fact, you mentioned the CEO wasn't supposed to carry out that type of operation.
No, I think he could have argued that he had to do it to help us to get away or something. That was probably his sense, but. Anyway, I suppose I'm glad he did.
And what did you do? Did you sneak up on the position and find where they were?
We surrounded it, yes. But we got somebody to tell us where the position was roughly. But I mean, we still had to find it. We surrounded it, yes. I mean, just commander's style, and then we just got up and went in, shot. Yeah.
So. You mentioned, did you do a reconnaissance of Rangoon at all?
Did I do that?
The reconnaissance of Rangoon towards the...
Yes, we did. We did a recce of Rangoon, because that was quite serious. I mean, much bigger, because that was no longer a Shong, that was a proper beach. We did, both teams, we did a recce there. There was no problem, because we apparently came back, to be honest, and say it's a lovely sandy beach, you know. And then we went in advance and did guide them in.
Again, how did you do that?
Just went with our LCA and netcom. I mean, again, it wasn't very terrible. We think we stayed motoring around offshore, one either end, and with a big flag up, and they saw us. I'm afraid we hadn't got anything terribly complicated. We knew when they were arriving.
So there was, I take it really from that element, there was less of a problem with the Japanese than there had been really with the Germans about being spotted in the same way.
Yes. Well, the Japanese. Well, you see, the thing was that that when we finally did the invasion of Rangoon, they'd actually left the night before. So it was an unopposed landing. But I mean, they'd probably known. They probably realised they were going to be. They'd got everybody out quickly. All the ships had gone.
And the war ended while you were out there?
Well, no, the war didn't end then. Actually, we were sent back straight away from Rangoon. Of course, as I say, there was not much fighting after that. You know, when you've seen Rangoon, I mean, it just pours down like buckets. So you simply tanks just. So we went back to our base. Yeah, then it's decided that the war was going to be 3 years more, and that COP would have to operate, or be able to operate by parachute, getting by parachute, because it was such vast distances. So my two teams, COP 9 and COP 1, which are the two ones just back from Rangoon, were told they got to get we weren't parachute trained. I mean, most commanders are, but we weren't. So we sent up to North India, where we took parachute course. Of course, in those days, they're very fast. It's not like these ones where you do for charity, where you come down very slow, stand on your feet. This is the wartime parachute. So we did that. We did our 5 jumps all over down there, and got qualified. You had to do a row there. You probably know the row.
A parachute row.
Yeah, you couldn't land on your feet. You had to do a row to save breaking your legs. And I was doing that off the bar after a good celebration, and I broke an ankle. That's my one wartime casualty. And I think the next day the bomb was dropped. So that was the end of the war. I came home and wondered what to do, really, because, of course, everything they started to do demobilisation in a big, big, big way. I loved the Navy. I was still a bachelor, and so I volunteered to stay on a sort of temporary basis. So I was sent out to Gib, and then to the Med, and appointed to a fleet Dan there as captain. I was lieutenant then, and then I had very, very nice, really, 2 years. We were with it was the 19th Minesweeping Facility. It was big, doing it the way I described, the old-fashioned ways, of course. Then these were German minefields in the Eastern Med, in the Aegean, northern and middle Aegean. So I did that for 2 years. I mean, we'd operate there and come back for boiler cleans to Malta, of course. In those days, Malta was still. There was still an odd battleship there occasionally. And so that was really the end of my Navy career. No.
So you'd volunteered for a 2-year...
I volunteered for a long time, and then actually during the 2 years, the Navy had offered permanent commissions to a group of people, about 100 I think, and I applied for one and got one. So I became RN, thick stripe. So I changed to thick stripe, became a regular, and did my 2 years there in that ship. Came back to Med, to England, at the end of the 2 years. I was appointed to then a rather lower ship, a converted ML, to do magnetic minesweeping in the Thames Estuary, which we did. We cleared a flotilla of those. We cleared the entire Thames Estuary of magnetic mines.
So were they still in position after the war?
No, they were on the bottom. They'd been dropped. They were bottom dropped. Aircraft dropped, Germans dropped them by plane. They just go to the bottom of this, where quite shallow water around the Thames Estuary, on sand, but they were still alive. Yeah, very much.
And when you'd been out in the Mediterranean, though, was that more set minefields? Was that the ones that the Germans had set?
Moored magnetics. They were moored. So you cut as I described it, you cut the facility went round and cut them. They come to the top. And our job as Dan lads, first of all, was to lay a line of dams. First of all, for the sweepers to go, the lead sweepers to go up, to know that you were in swept water. And then we had 3 downers to the flotilla, and then one of them was going up the line of swept mines, popping at them and sinking them. And their job was to get them sunk before the team came around and came again.
But that was, as I say, that was German minefields that they'd laid throughout the war, was it? So they were actually set ones. I take it with the magnetic ones, they were just individual mines that they'd dropped.
Yes, I mean in the Thames Estuary.
Yeah.
Yes, they would have been. Yes, that was definitely. They were laid magnetic fields. They declared this. And of course, they gave us a chart. The Germans gave us a chart, so they were dead accurate. So we knew exactly where they were. They were just a block of mines. They swept up perfectly efficiently. But we did. There were a lot of mines, and they were all live, mostly live. They went off, most of the time when we saw them. Some of them would sink, but most of them went bang. So you had to keep quite a long way. You couldn't use oilicans, but you kept well clear of them,
So what happened after the period when you were in the Thames?
Well, then I was appointed to a short job for a short time. It was sort of divisional officer at the Fleet Air Arm Naval Aviation Base.
Yeovilton?
Yes. And I stayed there as manager for a time. And then they sent me for a chest, scan thing, which they had there. Apparently I should have done it before anyway. I hadn't. And they picked up a small scar and they sung me out. So I was retired on no pension, but I was retired then.
So when was that? When were you retired? Roughly?
Well, war in 45. This must have been about 48, mustn't it? 40. Yes, 49. Something like that, yeah.
So, well, can you give me a sort of a feeling for what you feel now about having served with the Royal Navy?
Oh, I think it was one of the best time of my life, of course. Yeah. Of course it was, yes. I was desperately sorry to leave it, you know. But anyway, I've done nothing else. I'm straight from school. Obviously, it's a thing that you've done nothing else, do you? That's just the problem. You come back, what the hell do you do?
Just off the Nazi-controlled beaches lurks an X-craft. Inside this mini-submarine are 5 underwater spies.
Perhaps one of the earliest phases of the battle was the survey and preparatory work carried out by men serving aboard miniature submarines, the X-craft, who were effectively secret agents.
The X-craft were 50 feet long and barely 5 feet high. Some missions lasted 2 weeks in these cramped quarters. The surveillance gathered was used in making these maps, including some from the perspective of the sea, showing visible landmarks on the beach, like church steeples or houses. These were crucial for navigating the landings.
They came up with a novel idea. The view at the bottom here is the view that you would expect to see if you were coming in from a landing craft at any given point along this map.
Jim Booth was a member of this elite submarine force, venturing into mine-filled Nazi-controlled waters with barely any navigational guides.
Navigation, of course, was difficult because then there was no sat-nav. A classic old-fashioned navigational trip, pencil and ruler and a gyro compass.
Booth's mission was to go ahead of the invasion force and set up light beacons so the huge armada of Allied ships would know where to go. His submarine was assigned to the British landing beach codenamed Sword, the furthest east of the 5 beaches. He would be one of the first soldiers in action on D-Day. He was in position at 0100. Today, Jim Booth has come back to Normandy to take part in the investigation. This is no leisurely retirement cruise. The D-Day expedition has brought in a team from Canada with 2 deep-water submarines.
The veterans who stormed the beaches of Normandy, they're the most incredible people.
For the first time in 70 years, Jim Booth will go underwater off the coast of Normandy, just like he did for D-Day.
I suppose a very small amount worried, because he's 92.
I haven't been in a submarine at all since then.
I think you'll find you can see a lot better from that one than you could in yours.
Well, we had no window, of course, at all.
Ironically, this time the submarine is even smaller than the X-craft.
Okay.
But Jim Booth will only have to stay in the submarine for an hour instead of the 4 days he did before D-Day. Today's dive is in the exact same location off of Sword Beach. His shipmate is military historian Nick Hewitt.
Any second now, you're going to be underwater for the first time in 70 years.
70 years, absolutely, yeah, I know.
Here we go.
Right, there we go, look.
Look at that.
Look at that, isn't it amazing?
Isn't it just?
It's reasonably clear too today, isn't it?
There you go, target straight ahead.
The wreck's about 15 metres below.
Thrusters enabled topside.
Captain. There's a shadow there.
There is something there, you know.
Roger, I've got visual.
Jim's role on the 6th of June is to mark the safe channel through the enemy minefields. So Jim has to go out with a small group of men in advance of the landings, navigate themselves to exactly the right spot, surface alongside, we must remember, a minefield, light a beacon so that the incoming ships can pass safely through. So we need to keep our eyes peeled.
It was in this spot off of Sword Beach that Jim Booth placed the beacons on D-Day.
Did you have an understanding of how enormous the scale of it all was?
I think almost everybody, it was just a tiny cog in this vast wheel.
Yeah.
His subs surrounded by mines, Booth and the X-Craft crew had to find the exact location to set up the beacons. But with no lights on shore or radar, how did they do it?
Very, very complicated. One has to remember that all the navigational aids had been switched off because of security. And we knew we were in France. It didn't take very long to be recognized. There was a church tower. And we did recognize that.
In the end, Booth and his X-Craft crew navigated using the landmarks that had been mapped by the hydrographic department. Booth says it was the Allies' attention to detail in the planning that made the difference. And that was a direct result of the lessons learned from the disaster at Dieppe.
Dieppe was really intended to be a test run for Normandy. It did all the things wrong. Those lessons were learned, and this was put into good force for Normandy.
But the one thing the Allies couldn't control was the weather for the invasion, and the forecast did not look good. On the shores of Normandy, the Germans could only see the bad weather and thought that it would prevent any immediate invasion. They also did not see that just off the coast were a handful of small X-Craft submarines. On board one was Jim Booth.
It's a hell of a time ago, isn't it? 69 years. Obviously it is emotional, very emotional. It is very emotional indeed. It's sort of in the direction of the yacht, but where the last ripples are, you know, that sort of distance, yeah. We saw the soldiers playing football. Yeah, you know. That's the day before, actually. So they didn't know, did they, what was coming? May the 8th, 1945, it's a Tuesday. This is V-Day in Europe. Churchill makes a speech about the German surrender.
On VE Day, whilst people were celebrating at home, Jim Booth's war was far from over. He was in Burma, fighting the Japanese behind enemy lines.
Well, obviously we were pleased, if you like it, but I'd spent my entire life in the Navy up to that point, so any idea of peacetime was unknown to me, so I didn't really know what was going to happen.
75 years on, and Britain is fighting a different kind of enemy.
That's been up in your room, hasn't it, for the last few weeks?
Yes.
Isolated from much of his family, Jim sees similarities between the war and coronavirus.
All our services were dedicated to victory and to put up with everything to get there in the end, and that's the same thing applies to here, I suppose, doesn't it? We've got to stay going until we win.
Key to victory now is the NHS, a service Jim saw the work of first-hand after a vicious attack at his home in 2017.
I think they at one point said that I was likely not to survive, so you see it was quite serious damage they'd done to my brain and head. And they just went on, the National Health, and at the end of the day supported me afterwards all the time. Oh, they've been absolutely fantastic.
COVID-19 means a trip to Buckingham Palace to collect a British Empire Medal for services to charity will have to wait until next year, when Jim Booth will turn 100 years old. But he's happy to be patient and hopes the country as a whole will too.
It's so easy for me to say this because I'm lucky here because I've got a nice garden to go out to, and I realise so many people haven't got a garden and they're just a flat somewhere and children screaming. It must be difficult. But I hope that they'll absolutely stick it out and that it will work in the end, and I'm sure it will.
Brilliant. Well done, Daddy. Thank you.